To construct the back panel, you will refer to page 4, step 2. You will notice that you have only two pieces to work with, so this will go a lot faster than the front panel. The first thing you'll do is make sure that you have your gathering dots marked already. Remember at the beginning when we marked with our marking tool, 2 little dots at the top, those are your gathering marks. So what we will do is switch your machine to the longest stitch possible, and you will lock at the beginning but not at the end. You want those threads loose so that you can pull and gather. So you will do essentially a long basting stitch close to the edge, but you want it to be at least a 1/4 inch from the edge so that it doesn't get so close that it'll fray out, but not so far in that it'll get in the way of your 1/2 inch seam allowance. So it needs to stay somewhere in between your seam allowance. So a 1/4 inch is about right. So let's take it to the sewing machine. I've already lengthened my stitch to as long as it will go. Every machine is different. On my machine, it was 5 millimeters. So I will align my edge with the 1/4 inch mark and lower my needle at my first dot. I'm going to lower it manually just so I'm sure that it's at the right spot. And I'm going to lock my stitch at the beginning. You could do a back stitch or a lock stitch depending on what your machine is capable of. And now I'm just going to pretty much stitch a straight stitch all the way to my second dot. And I will not back stitch at the end. I'm just leaving this loose just like this. So you lift your presser foot and your needle. Don't forget to do that. And then you pull and leave those thread tails a little bit long enough that you can pull. They don't have to be super long. Now, the object here is to gather this area so that your curve here will end up being the same length as this curve. So that's the final objective here. So you want it to end up kind of sort of looking like this with a nice little gathered edge in the middle. So you will grab your bobbin thread, which is the bottom. That's my top thread. Here's my bobbin thread. And you're going to gently pull. Don't pull too hard because sometimes you can break those threads. You will use your fingers to just gently guide your fabric along the thread until you have some nice gathers. At this point, I'm only eyeballing it because I can adjust it later. So you're just pulling and gathering. See how beautiful it looks already, nice and gathered. So I'm just going to grab my top panel and sort of line it up against this to see if I need to gather it more. And it looks like I need to gather it just a little bit more, not too much. And you know what? Don't worry if it's not perfect right at this point because you can adjust it later, right before you get ready to sew those two pieces together. So I'm going to take it to the ironing board and just press these gathers down so they're nice and flat. You want it to be nice and flat at the top so it'll stitch easier. If you have a lot of bulk at the top, sometimes it's a little bit harder to stitch. And also another helpful trick is to run another row of stitches right on top of your basting stitches. But for now, it looks a little messed up right here, but all of this, trust me, it's all going to get fixed once we sew the two pieces together. You're going to align these two right sides together. Remember the concave and convex, we're doing essentially the same thing. You'll take your pins, place a pin right at the center, one at the corner. Make sure those corners are nice and aligned. And another one at the other corner. And then now you can pull and make sure that center area is gathered enough so that all of your curves will lay nicely together. You will pin up until the gathered area on both sides. Again, you can use as many or as few pins as you'd like. It's all preference there. Yeah, it's looking really nice already. And then I like to adjust those gathers. Now that we have everything pinned, I like to adjust those gathers so that all of the fabric just sits there perfectly. One more pin here. I know it looks like a lot of pins, but you're going to want this area to be just right, so I'm using as many pins as I can. There we go. Now you're going to take it to the sewing machine. Make sure you set your stitch length back down. You don't want to do this with a long stitch length because it'll gather it, and now we're not gathering right now. We're only sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I have set my stitch length back down to the beginning, which was 2.5, and we're sewing. Remember to align it with your 1/2 inch mark at this point. Reinforce at the beginning, at the and at the end. Periodically, it's a good idea to check and make sure you are not sewing up another part of your fabric that you're not intending to. So just kind of tug on your fabric and make sure everything's out of the way, that you're only sewing those two pieces together and nothing else. And you can sew slowly around these curves just to make sure they are perfect. I'm a fast sewer with some things and a slow sewer with others. You'll see this. Sometimes I feel like I just need to slow down things just to make sure everything is perfect. Now that you have your seam and your perfect gathers in the back, then it's time to take it to the serger, and again you can just do a zigzag stitch to finish this. Again, make sure you tug on that fabric in the back just to make sure you don't have anything stuck in there that you don't want. Because once you're serging and you're cutting off, your blade is cutting off part of the fabric, you don't want it to cut off something else. So we are tugging, and every now and then I lift up just to make sure everything is in place. And again, there's no shame in going slow and steady just to make sure everything is right. Great. Now you just lift up that back panel. It's looking really great so far. And just as we did with the front panel, you want to press the seam towards the top, and then you can adjust those gathers just to make sure they're pressed all going towards the bottom, not sideways. You can apply a little steam just to make sure all those little gathers at the back are just perfectly in place. I'm just going to shoot it with a little bit of steam right here. It's looking great so far. And then continue to tug on that top piece just to make sure that curve is perfect. And then I like to flip it towards the front and give it a nice little press from the front. Wonderful. So now all that's left is the top stitching. So just like we did in the front, you are not going to top stitch. You won't do the 2 rows of top stitching. We're only going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch from the seam, and since your seam allowance was pressed towards the top, you're going to top stitch at the top edge. So let's take this back to the sewing machine. I'm going to adjust my stitch length to top stitching length, which is 3.5. Or whatever you prefer. Again, this part is, there's no right or wrong way. If you like a shorter stitch length for top stitching, then you can do it like that. I like a 3.5 millimeter. I just think it looks nice. And I'm going to top stitch exactly 1/8 inch from the seam. And this is just so it'll match my front top stitching. Make sure you reinforce the front and bottom. Follow that curve. And reinforce the end of it too. And there you have it. Your back panel is complete. How fast and easy was that? Next, we're going to learn how to attach the pockets to the front and back.